Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're stepping right onto the floor of the Northgate Industrial Processing Facility. Picture this massive, complex web of pipes, valves, and giant chemical reaction vessels just humming away in the dead of night. It's an absolute marvel of modern engineering, entirely governed by strict protocols and advanced digital safety networks. But what happens when a system that complex becomes so hopelessly bogged down in its own bureaucracy that it nearly destroys itself? Well, that is the wild story of the Northgate thermal event.
To really grasp the stakes here, we've got to look at one terrifying number, 112 degrees Celsius. This is the absolute critical temperature threshold for a thermal runaway in a reactor known as Cascade Unit 7. It's the exact, unyielding point where a controlled chemical process stops being a process and just becomes an inevitable, catastrophic explosion.
At the center of this deadly labyrinth is our human element, Dario Fenwick Baumgarten. Dario cleaned the gear. He knew the machine in his bones. As he put it, "I did not know the gear would eat me. No one told me. It was not in the manual." His experience perfectly highlights the central conflict of this entire explainer, that terrifying gap between the sterile, hyper-specific procedures of corporate bureaucracy and the raw, physical reality experienced by the folks actually working on the floor.
Okay, let's get into Section 1, the thermal runaway.
Picture the scene. It's 3 a.m. on the graveyard shift, or, the extended overnight operational period if we're using official company speak. Dario is alone with the machine. At precisely 4:07 a.m., a temperature sensor inside Cascade Unit 7 ticked up to 97.4 degrees Celsius. Now, this wasn't an alarm bells ringing moment for the automated system, but it was an abnormal spike that Dario spotted instantly. Why? Because he'd spent 11 years learning the very specific physical rhythms of this hardware. He just knew it was climbing faster than it should be.
So what exactly is a thermal runaway? Well, think of it like a positive feedback loop gone completely rogue. If the polymer feed inside reaction vessel RV7 gets too hot, the chemical reaction actually speeds up. That faster reaction generates even more heat, which speeds the reaction up even more. Before you know it, the cooling systems are completely irrelevant. You've essentially created an unstoppable engine running without a governor, barreling straight toward that 112-degree threshold.
Which brings us to Section 2, blinded by bureaucracy.
You see, this disaster didn't just happen out of thin air. It was a slow-moving catastrophe. For 8 months, Dario had been noticing temperature drifts. 6 months ago, the water chemistry was flagged. 5 months ago, a critical pressure valve actually failed its bench test. And 11 weeks ago, an unassigned remote monitoring account caused all safety alarms to be silently suppressed. Every single warning sign was dutifully documented, filed into a system called InfraConnect, and then promptly swallowed whole by broken administrative queues.
And why were those queues broken? Just take a look at these roles. Unit Operations Manager, Process Safety Manager, Regional Operations Director. They were all completely vacant. There was literally nobody employed at the company to read the critical safety forms that Dario and his team were submitting. The system successfully sorted its safety data into neat little administrative containers, but the people who were supposed to look inside those containers simply did not exist.
Let's move on to Section 3, the dollar store notebook.
The floor workers somehow had to compensate for this entirely blind system, and this creates just a wild juxtaposition at the heart of the event. On one hand, you have the official corporate record, which firmly believed everything was perfectly fine because its digital forms were quietly resting in unread queues. But then you have Dario. Dario felt the actual physical heat of the valves. He could hear the changing acoustics of a failing impeller, and he was logging this raw, physical truth in a completely unauthorized, cheap dollar store composition notebook. Meanwhile, the tension on the floor is seriously increasing. The temperature has now climbed to 101 degrees. This is the exact point where a high-temperature alarm absolutely should have triggered a remote response from central monitoring. But instead of an operator calling the plant to warn them, the alarm just accumulated, silently, in a Tier 2 queue. Why? Because the facility's account manager had left the company back in January. And that leads us right into Section 4, breaking the rules.
As the stakes skyrocket and the heat climbs, Dario and his graveyard shift supervisor Roger Hendricks are in an impossible bind. They desperately need to manually bypass the failing heat exchanger to cool the system. But to do that officially, they have to follow the management of change procedure. That means writing a proposed change, completing a risk assessment, and obtaining 3 manager signatures. Assuming those managers even existed, which we know they didn't, this requires a minimum of 25 minutes of paperwork. But the reaction vessel is accelerating. They only had about 12 minutes before the system literally tore itself apart.
So Supervisor Hendricks makes a drastic call. He digs up an obscure emergency loophole deep in some appendix to override the system. He says, "I'm authorizing an emergency bypass activation. I accept personal liability." By doing this, he had to take total personal legal responsibility, finally authorizing Dario to manually bypass that failing heat exchanger.
But man, it was just too late for the heat exchanger. The second Dario opened the bypass, the primary heat exchange impeller finally shattered. The temperature hit 107.4 degrees. The unit lost all heat transfer capacity. The cooling flow was completely blocked.
Hendricks immediately makes a completely unauthorized 911 call. Fire services tell him they are 12 minutes out. 12 minutes. Meanwhile, Dario realizes the automated system is still furiously pumping fresh, highly reactive chemicals right into the boiling vessel. He sprints 80 meters across the facility. He navigates the electrical room entirely by memory and manually kills the feed pump breakers to stop the system from feeding the bomb. But the chemical reaction inside that vessel is still generating its own heat. And here we hit the terrifying climax. The temperature peaks at 112.1 degrees. That is literally a tenth of a degree past the theoretical runaway threshold. A number, mind you, that Dario wasn't even allowed to know because he didn't have a level 9 administrative clearance.
And then, just a massive hiss of pressure. At 58 pounds of pressure, an automatic relief valve finally popped open. This was a valve that had been tagged for an overdue maintenance test 6 weeks prior, but amazingly, it worked. It opened, sending all that highly explosive chemical vapor up to the thermal oxidizer on the roof, which safely burned it off. The temperature stopped climbing, it began to drop. The facility was saved, entirely in spite of the system's design.
Let's unpack the fallout in our final part, Section 5, System vs. Reality.
You really can't make up this level of bureaucratic absurdity. A few days after surviving this near disaster, Supervisor Hendricks received 2 envelopes in the mail on the exact same day. One was a formal disciplinary warning from HR for initiating a 911 call without corporate authorization. The other, a commendation from the VP of Operations praising his exceptional judgment in saving the plant. He was literally punished and praised simultaneously for the exact same life-saving action.
The day shift operator, Okonkwo, who had actually been keeping his own secret journal of the machine's failures, absolutely hit the nail on the head. He said, "It's not official, it's true. Those aren't the same thing." And he was right. During the massive investigation that followed, it was Dario's completely unauthorized dollar store notebook that became the single most vital, accurate investigative document in the entire facility.
Ultimately, the corporate investigation spit out 47 corrective actions. One of them, Action 031, finally mandated that the safety limits of the machine be shared with the operators. Dario, after 11 years of cleaning and maintaining a machine that could easily kill him, was finally handed the piece of paper that told him exactly where the edge of disaster actually was.
It really makes you think about the digital cues and procedures in your own life, doesn't it? Because if a multi-million-dollar system's final desperate line of defense against utter destruction is an unauthorized dollar store notebook, who is really in control of the machine? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope it gave you an entirely new perspective on the invisible systems all around us. Catch you next time.